Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with C2G, and I am speaking today with Clara Botto, a Brazilian climate justice campaigner who serves as the Science-Policy Thematic Facilitator of the major group on children and youth to the UN Environment Programme, and is currently working with C2G's Youth Climate Voices on the governance of solar radiation modification. Amongst other SRM-related activities, Clara was an observer to the marine cloud brightening fieldwork taking place in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and wrote a statement and a science policy brief for the UN's 8th STI Forum. Clara also campaigns with World's Youth for Climate Justice to get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the climate crisis as a human rights issue, and has been named a new European voice on existential risk with the European Leadership Network. Clara Botto, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
Brilliant. Well, let's maybe start with your journey. Growing up in Brazil, what motivated you to get involved and work on climate change? And maybe how do you see the climate crisis affecting your country, and how do you envisage this changing over your lifetime?
I believe that growing up, as a kid, I was very much connected to nature, thanks to my stepfather, who's a bird photographer. So I grew up traveling to random parts of Brazil, which my friends weren't aware of, and definitely not touristic places. And at first, I guess I wasn't aware of all of the problems that we had concerning the environment, but I already had this deep appreciation for nature. But when I was 15, I think that was when I first considered myself an activist for the environment because of veganism protests. So when I was 15, I became vegan, and I understood that our current food systems, they have a huge impact on the climate. And so that was my entry point into climate works. And then shortly after that, in different aspects of my life and my studies, I made sure that I was linking what I was doing to both the environment and climate. And then thinking of your question on how the climate crisis is impacting Brazil, I think in the different places that I grew up in there, I was familiar already with natural disasters, which to my view, they aren't natural, because the disasters itself, they only happen because our communities are not resilient to withstand the phenomenon. And so I think if we have already been seeing those happening in the past decades with the climate crisis, as we all know, they will be intensified. And so I'm really worried, because we still don't have cities and communities that are resilient to those events, and the tendencies that they will keep becoming more frequent.
So in your self-introduction, you used the word, you realize you're a climate activist. What does that mean to you? What does it mean to be an activist?
I think it's standing up for what you believe in and for what you believe is wrong. So it's publicly speaking of the things you believe should be changed, and in my experience, also pointing out solutions or different pathways to the current narrative or the system that we have.
Great. Well, and then of course you got involved in international climate diplomacy. How did that happen? How did you get involved in the world of the United Nations and climate talks?
I think as many of my friends at school, having the typical UN model system being discussed in class, and being also part of Model UNs. So I was actually only part of one Model UN. It was about the World Water Conference, if I'm not mistaken, when I was 15, 16, around that. And then later on, I became aware that there were opportunities to get involved in the UN system as a young person.
So in 2018, I believe you were a youth delegate to the UN Youth Assembly. How did you find that? What were your first? You'd done a model UN. This is the real thing, right? So how did you find it worked out? It looked like in practice.
So back then, it was the first time I was in the UN, and of course, it's as a young person, and when you go there, it feels really, really important, right? And I went with the Brazilian delegation, but the Youth Assembly isn't meant to come up with any conclusions or decisions or anything. But it really struck me that for quite a few years, I felt that I was the only one within the bubbles that I was in Brazil. I felt that I was the only one that was like really concerned about the problems of the world that we face and that really wanted to make things. And then going there and being exposed to young people from all around the world, it gave me a bit of hope that we had a bigger body of people that was trying to do the same things that I was. So yeah, it felt hopeful.
You mentioned that the assembly wasn't there to take decisions per se, but I'm interested, how do you feel in general? To what extent do UN processes hear and take into account the concerns of young people? What kind of avenues there are to make sure those concerns and thoughts go into some kind of decision-making processes?
I think there are different avenues that a young person can become part of the system. That doesn't mean that they are efficient and that young voices are really listened to and taken into account. But we have structures such as youth constituencies to different UN bodies. And I believe these are pathways that young people find not only to learn, but also to make contributions in the different UN processes that we have.
So what does it mean to be the Science-Policy Thematic Facilitator of the Children and Youth Major Group to the UN Environment Programme? There's a lot of different terms in there. Can you help me understand what it all means?
Yeah, so as I had just mentioned, we have the system of youth constituencies. And so the one that serves UNEP is CYMG. So as you said, Children and Youth Major Group. And basically, we as young people, as part of this constituency, we can provide our inputs to the processes that UNEP has already been following. And so UNEP, whenever they have to consult with their stakeholders, for example, they ask for the Children and Youth Major Group if we have any contributions to make to a specific document, or if they're hosting a conference. We usually try to make sure that we have young people attending who are part of the constituency, and then there they can also either pressure policymakers or make statements on behalf of the constituency and so on. And then as a science policy thematic facilitator, me and my colleague, we're on this 1-year mandate. And then we have the freedom to look at different science policy processes that UNEP is following. And again, not only provide our own inputs and learn, but then also report back to the bigger constituency on what has been discussed specifically on science policy.
Right. So what, going to closer to what C2G does, obviously there is this idea being touted that there could be a form of an approach called Solar Radiation Modification, which could help be an additional source of reducing climate risk by reflecting some sunlight into space. What got you interested in that topic, and what attracted you to the C2G's Youth Climate Voices program?
So the first time that I heard about SRM, so Solar Radiation Modification, was back in 2019 at the, I always forget the exact name, but International Climate Geoengineering Symposium that happened in Rio de Janeiro, where I was based back then. And I attended as an observer, and at first what really struck me was that I was the only young person in the room, even though it was a public event. And also that climate geoengineering and SRM back then were terms that I had never heard of before, even though I was already engaged in sustainable development and climate and environmental groups. So leaving that conference, I was even a bit afraid that I was the only, again, young person there in the room that had listened to all of the things that the scientists had said, and a bit alone that no one else was talking about those technologies. And so for years, till I heard of C2G, I had SRM and geoengineering as terms in my head, but didn't have the chance to explore them. And the first time I heard about C2G was in the beginning of 2022, when they were preparing a talk about the role of science fiction and new emerging climate technologies. And I had read a lot of science fiction talking about the topic, and that interested me. And it felt really good to see that there were organizations that were looking into something that had been in my head for a while. So that's how I got into C2G and SRM more, like, with more energy.
Great. Well, tell me a little bit about how the experience has been. What have you done? What have been the highlights? What have you learned about SRM and its governance doing this?
I think it was a very enriching experience in the sense that I had the opportunity to take a step back and really learn about not only the science, but also what other stakeholders groups have been saying about SRM and what's the current state of SRM governance that we have in the world. And then, as I was already someone that was interested in the topic and even a bit scared that those things weren't discussed in a mainstream way, it gave me a lot of knowledge and the chance to engage with people who are already either doing research or talking about those things for years.
So there, let's maybe dig into some of the actual SRM approaches being explored. The most well-known, the one that often gets the headlines, is this idea of stratospheric aerosol injection, and we'll talk about that in a second. But others include marine cloud brightening and ground albedo modification. Let's take a couple of these in turn. I was really interested to see that you were an observer to the marine cloud brightening project in Australia. I'd love to hear a bit about that experience, what you did, what impressions you got, and yeah, what kind of issues you think it raises.
Yeah, so I was invited to be a part. Well, I reached out to the team that's doing the marine cloud brightening work in Australia, and I was invited to join them as an observer in the field work, and it felt really inspiring to see that things that you only read in policy briefs, for example, during our learning pathway in C2G, they're happening, and there's a big team looking at that, and they're really committed into the work that they're doing. And it's very different just reading about different types of technologies and actually being there on the field and seeing how it works, right? So it was definitely like an experience that before I could never imagine how it would look like. And it brought me lots of questions. I already went with questions, and I think I came back with tons more.
Can you describe it a bit? Did you get on the boat? I'm just interested, exactly what did you do? What did you see? I'd love to hear about what it all looked like in practice. Yeah.
So there are different research stations, and I was mostly in 3 of them. So there were 2 vessels that were conducting the experiment. One was the one where the machines were, and the other one was collecting data from the experiment. And then they also had islands where they were also collecting data. And so I was mostly in the data vessel and on the island. So I got to spend more time with the scientists that were analyzing the results from the experiment.
Great. And so what kind of lessons did you come away with about marine cloud brightening, and what kind of ideas did this experience give you in terms of how it might need to be governed?
Yeah, so unlike other SRM technologies, marine cloud brightening is very local. And so the intention of this experiment there in Australia is to protect the Great Barrier Reef from the mass bleaching events that have already been happening in the past years. And so I think the main thing I got from the experiment is that first, we still need to see if that's viable, if we can really get the theory and the lab work of marine cloud brightening into practice. So it doesn't matter if they can see that, yes, we can brighten the clouds if there won't be an impact in the reef. And so I believe the process of getting the research done is much bigger than we think, because apart from all of the atmospheric scientists who are looking into that, there's also a huge collaboration that is being done with marine biologists, for example, for them to assess if brightening the clouds can make the reef more resilient.
You've also expressed interest in learning more about the Arctic Ice Project. Tell us about that, and what your initial thoughts are there.
So going to another part of the world, right? The Arctic Ice Project wants to assess a different type of technology. They use micro hollow sphere glasses that can again reflect solar radiation back. And the idea there is that those glass spheres can prevent the glaciers from melting. They're not doing field work yet. First, they need to assess if this technology won't harm the environment. So all of the marine life, for example, that is under the water, where they'll place the spheres. And I didn't attend any of their field works because they're not happening. But I was with their team in a fundraising event to learn more about the current state of research and how civil society as a whole that is supporting their project sees climate interventions.
Great. And let's move on to stratospheric aerosol injection. This idea of spraying essentially aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect back a small portion of sunlight, perhaps analogous to what happens after a volcanic eruption. What issues does that raise for you, and what plans do you have to continue following developments in that area?
So I think the key difference, as I've mentioned already before, is that SAI will involve global impacts, unlike the research done in the Arctic or the one in Australia. And I think even though I haven't personally engaged with any research team that's looking into SAI, only some like scattered researchers, I think we need to have really global conversations to address something that might have global impacts if we decide that we need to use those technologies. And under the current global governance system that we have, we don't have solutions for how to govern SAI. So I think as more universities or governments start putting money into SAI research, for example, it's key that we are already putting energy and efforts into talking about its governance.
Great. Well, you and your colleagues from the Youth Climate Voices program are developing a platform, I understand, called SRM Youth Watch. Tell me a little bit about what that will look like. What are your plans with it? How can that help build governance around these issues?
So we're still in initial stages of coming up with this platform, as you said, SRM Youth Watch. But I think the main idea is that we need to have a global youth platform, not only to host youth-led initiatives that are already looking into SRM. There are different types of technologies and from different areas of study, from students with a philosophy background that are looking into SRM, or engineers that are looking into that. So we want to be a platform that can host those different projects, but also hopefully a recognized network that can provide inputs to governments or think tanks or even individual policymakers that want to become more informed about SRM.
I'm interested what kind of reactions you've had from fellow climate activists, fellow people in the youth movement to your interest in SRM. What kind of, because obviously there's some deep concerns held by many about these approaches, and some would really oppose, even research, let alone, going any further. What kind of reactions have you had? What kind of conversations have you had? And how would you say young people are kind of viewing these ideas?
I think the main reaction I get is of complete shock to hear about those technologies, because it's something new. So I've been in many situations where climate and environmental activists are just surprised to hear about something that is being discussed in the international sphere, but that is not getting to their attention. So that's one of the reactions that I get. There's also a bit like the opposite of not wanting to talk about it because it's, to their opinion, too controversial. I've also heard that we shouldn't actually be talking about SRM, not because it's controversial, but just because we have other priorities, as some of my colleagues think. And then there are some that are just very skeptical about any climate altering technology because they think it's too sci-fi or it's not realistic. So why would we waste time talking about them?
Have you ever felt a sense of personal criticism from some people that, oh, you shouldn't be involved in this? How have you dealt with that kind of sense that you're taking quite a bold step into this area?
Yeah, I think not criticism, but looking into SRM. But I think some young people, because they've never heard of SRM, they think it's a bit sketchy, so that I'm involved with like sketchy things or things that only happen behind closed doors, that I don't know, like really, that I'm like a really futuristic thinker person or something like this. So I wouldn't say that I've received like strong and negative views towards what I've been doing, but just some people are a bit cautious about where I'm coming from and who I'm dealing with in a way.
There's you mentioned earlier, your interest in nature, and that's partly what brought you into this. There is one sort of, I guess, area of concern amongst some critics that SRM is unnatural, right? And this is, we need to be dealing with these issues not with unnatural, but going back to nature. How do you feel about the relationship between nature and technology, and how does SRM potentially fit into that?
I think the point that we're at right now is unnatural because we humans have brought us here. So it's already a given. We're in the Anthropocene. We have created all of those things that are happening in the climate around us. And so in an ideal world, I wish we wouldn't be talking about SRM as well, that we would be using only nature-based solutions, for example, to tackle the climate crisis. But then in an ideal world, we wouldn't have the climate crisis in the first place. And so I think that this strong attachment that I have to nature is actually what got me into SRM, because I think we just need to be looking at all of the solutions that we might have and that might help us to preserve what we have. But I think this also comes with an understanding that we as humans are part of nature, because I think ecosystems and nature, if we're speaking of them detached of human beings, they're much more resilient than we are. So I think it's also bringing us humans back into a position as part of nature and the planet as a whole.
As you develop this platform, which will include sharing information about SRM, what kind of challenges do you see in a world with so much misinformation right now, where so many confusing sources of experts or not experts are telling everybody all sorts of different things about everything? How do you help young people find the right sources of information to deal with misinformation? How are you going to approach that?
I think we have to rely on science, on the best science available, and on trustworthy research that's being done on SRM for us to inform young people on what those technologies are. I think a lot of misinformation comes from just saying things out of our own mouths and not fact checking, for example. And also because, again, SRM is very controversial and we have very strong opinions about it. I think sometimes people just say things that might be wrong just because they haven't read an article that was published 2 weeks ago, for example. And this happens because it's a topic that's evolving really fast. And so I think that information also needs to be up to date with the research that has been happening. So I think it will be about constantly updating ourselves on what has been going on in the scientific world.
Also, thinking about your work on human rights, climate and human rights, do you see a relationship between SRM and human rights and climate justice? How would SRM fit into those frames, those objectives?
Yeah, I think that two communities that are very climate vulnerable historically, I think SRM as a tool needs to be decided by those, the deployment of SRM in those communities needs to be decided by them, as they're the ones that have already been struggling with the climate crisis, and that, as research tells us, will be suffering in the years to come as well. And so I think the human rights approach to SRM is that we need to inform communities that will either benefit the most or be negatively impacted the most if we are to use one of these technologies. So at this point, I would say it's providing accurate information so that they can make their own mind about those technologies as well.
So just to finish on this bit about the SRM Youth Watch and your plans on that, is there anything that we should be looking forward to over the coming months, or is it still very much in the design process, the design phase?
So last week we had our first event that happened in Bangladesh.
Okay.
Yes. And in the coming months, so in September, we'll be in New York for side events happening around the UN General Assembly. We have just confirmed that we'll be hosting an event on the 17th of September. So you can save the date, and more information will be published in our website. And then till the end of the year, we're planning to also be part of another environment and global governance related events.
And the website is?
SRM youthwatch.org.
Great. Maybe I could just finish on sort of a broader question about motivation and hope and anxiety. I mean, there's a lot of concern out there about the rising levels of climate anxiety amongst young people, and how that might impact the way they see the world and the decisions they make. How do you keep hope? How do you maintain hope whilst also being aware of how serious the challenges are? And what kind of advice do you have for others who might be struggling to see a brighter future?
I think that's a question I get a lot, also because I've struggled. I do struggle still with climate anxiety. But I think I've just changed my mind towards how I tackle the climate crisis. So I think I've lived a phase of climate doom, but that didn't mean that I was stuck and didn't do anything. But I think there are stages of climate anxiety that don't really help us to move forward or to be our best version. So if we're just angry and complaining about everything, that won't help because you're not proposing solutions. But then if you're really impacted in a way that also makes you just get stuck somewhere, then you're also not moving forward and not progressing. So I think it's not about shutting down the anxiety feelings, but it's about how you can use those things that you're feeling to move forward and to help, because otherwise we might just end up going down in a rabbit hole. And climate anxiety is a real thing. Like I know depression can come from climate anxiety. And so I would say, whenever I'm talking to a friend, for example, that has been struggling, I think the best thing we can, not the best, but one of the things we can try to do is to find where we see ourselves most useful in the climate fight, which is not only in climate groups. For example, you can be an artist and contribute. You can be a doctor and contribute. So I think it's just about finding your place and doing the best you can each day.
Well, that's a great thought to end on. So thank you so much, Clara Botto, for taking part in this C2G talk.
Thanks, Mark.